can now go directly to the panel with our 30 speakers. Thank you all for being here and joining us in this panel with our 30 speakers. And good news for those of us who missed the first talks, the talks are going to be uploaded to YouTube, so we can watch them later. So I think, yeah, Leon and Murali is also here. Leon is an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen. In his keynote speech, he described in comprehensive detail the variety of data sets created for detecting online abuse and harm, and provided recommendations for future annotation efforts. Murali is a faculty fellow at Race and Technology at Data and Society. Murali is currently working on the remanifestation of caste and social hierarchies in digital culture, such as caste hate speech. And his speech called for more attention to this overlooked type of hate and abuse. And Deb is a PhD student at Fundamental Machine Learning Research Group. And we just heard her talk about where she emphasized that the shortcomings of auditing practices and called for structured approaches for evaluating the generated data sets and resulting models. So one issue that was mentioned in different sessions today is that dealing with online abuse and harm requires collaborations among different academic fields, civil society, policymakers, and tech companies. In this regard, Murali's talk denoted the absence of such links, which lead to disregarding hate and abuse based on caste. So I wanted to start our conversation by asking how you think this interdisciplinary work can be conducted and what can accelerate the flow of this flow of information. So I want to ask Leon, how do you think such a collaboration can be initiated?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to the panel as well. So, I mean, the things we're dealing with, these are all really human behaviors and they affect humans through human constructs, which makes it really hard for these things to be conveyed in any one of these individual fields, doesn't it? You know, I mean, because we exist in many different spheres where there are many things we do that all overlap and have very different contexts. So, yeah, I think, I mean, this opening statement is pretty uncontroversial. I think we can say that. For me, I think it's easiest to do this sort of thing if you can identify reasons, right? You have to find a reason for another person to join the conversation. So, for example, in Denmark, we've had a recent survey saying this was a really easy one to drag people in with, right? Saying, well, 68% of people don't feel comfortable discussing anything online in public because of the hard tone, right? And in this case, then this is a kind of a really convenient situation where it's a research problem, right? We don't know how to deal with this. We don't know how to measure it so well. In fact, we don't know where the problems are, where the hard tone is, what hard tone is even. But that's something that academics can help out with. But then also this is a direct threat to both policymakers, because if you don't have a functioning discourse, then you don't have a functioning democratic discourse, then you have a poorly functioning democracy, which leads to kind of instability in government in the longer term. So this was something policymakers will be instantly interested in my experience. I mean, if you get the right policymaker, right? And then tech companies, of course, I think in terms of CSR, the corporate social responsibility, they certainly have to appear to be interested in fixing this problem. Whereas I think in reality, this comes down to a revenue question, and that revenue depends on engagement, right? And there are certainly some forms of abuse that will boost engagement in certain communities. So that dialogue, I think, is probably one of the harder dialogues to deal with. And then, of course, I think civil society is affected, and if one can identify large groups in that, and that's great. But I mean, just as Deb said in her talk, if these things don't work for everyone, then they don't work very well.
Yeah, just elaborating on that with Deborah's comments about like creating this kind of data sets. So I was wondering how these minority perspectives can be captured in doing auditing or creating the data sets, and even in for defining what is abuse in different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of opportunity. There's a lot more opportunity to engage civil society groups and these nonprofits than I think people realize. There are quite a few sort of grassroots community-led groups that are sort of support mechanisms for their particular communities with respect to their experiences with online abuse. Like I mentioned Glitch, for example, or even within the NAACP, there's different groups thinking about online harms with respect to, you know, individuals coming from the identities of those that they're representing. And I think that people don't, I think researchers don't always recognize the opportunity to like really interact with those groups and just reach out to them and actually make that connection to begin the process of connecting with, you know, their constituents and you know, their members, which are, you know, to the order of like, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. It's really like a large community of people genuinely impacted by online harm and seeking support in these grassroots organizations. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity through those kind of partnerships to begin to collect, you know, data sets that are very grounded in the experience and the lived experience of those that are really going through it, where that, you know, this online harm issue is something that's really impacting their lives to the point of them seeking a support group. So yeah, I think that is sort of like an underdeveloped partnership between academics and those organizing, you know, the communities that are impacted by this. And I think that partnership could actually extend to the point of, you know, very conscious and very, like I mentioned, sort of not blind data diversification. You know, we've had issues with, you know, IBM and others where they just sort of blindly want to diversify their data set, and it'll lead very easily to exploitation and to issues of privacy and consent. So a very sort of thoughtful data collection partnership between these groups that are currently under considered, and you know, the academics doing this work could be really interesting and impactful. Something else I've been thinking a lot about has been, you know, and I think Leon actually mentioned this in his talk, a lot about the taxonomy that we use to sort of describe online abuse, you know, really currently being very top down, you know, not necessarily coming through the perspective or the lens of those impacted. I think the way that, you know, for example, someone from the LGBTQ community might characterize their experience with abuse and how the language that they might use to categorize the genre of abuse that they see and that they witness might be very different from what even academics in this space might see as the clear categories or the obvious characterizations of you know, the abuse that they see. So I think that like even engaging a smaller subset of these communities to sort of like facilitate in the annotation process of things and providing, like sort of sourcing from these communities the guidelines around annotation and like how we actually characterize what it means to be abused and what they're like, just collecting more lived experiences and using that to help us with the characterizations might lead to some more useful data sets. And that might actually provide an avenue for more effective sort of evaluation or auditing of like how well do we actually identify, you know, categories of abuse that align with the lived experience of those going through that abuse.
That's a really nice point. Sorry, just to add on briefly, if I may. I think, so what you're speaking to here kind of really reminds me of, so I recently was lucky enough to have a fantastic researcher working with her. I think she's in the call, Feline Zeiner, and she led a study we did on, excuse me, on annotating online misogyny, right? So we looked at all the categories that people have found before, and then, I mean, using your phrasing, this is this real enforcing, really, of a preconception of how abuse is going to look. And with that phrasing, right, it's kind of screaming, you're not going to get great data, right? Already you're like, yeah, okay, you need to look at it again. And so the annotators in this case, they looked through all the data and they kept finding this kind of weird well, this behavior that didn't fit the categories. So weird in terms of those preconceptions category that didn't fit behavior that didn't fit it. And that's when people were, for example, just, it felt almost like this Soviet propaganda technique of whataboutism, when you keep asking questions and, you know, we've all seen the trolls, right? You try and exhaust the other person, you're not engaged in the conversation and so on. And we were looking, and it turned out, so within the social psychology literature and the feminism literature as well, there was this term was well understood, had been really well studied, really emerging. And it's just, so they called it neo-sexism, right? Which is when you either give a different level of burden of proof to someone based on the gender they're talking about, or if there's a well-known fact, right? We say like identity group X is marginalized, and the person says, well, actually, I need to see evidence about that, right? So when they kind of just putting a lot of conversational load on something that's already known. And we wouldn't have, this never would have emerged, right? And I mean, to be frank, this wasn't even in my mind that this possibly could exist until you start talking to the affected group, right? That is, that is the data. I mean, that's the only way to do it,
Yeah, I think this, sorry, I want to allow for more questions, but I think, this also like reveals like what I was mentioning earlier around, it can actually become harmful when you have these imposed categories that misalign, not just because they're not going to be effective at, you know, describing the experience that those that are impacted are actually going through, but there's also this issue, and this was sort of mentioned in the Brennan report of, you might have, you know, those coming up with these categories, let's say they're coming from a particular perspective or worldview, and they have certain prejudices that they integrate into these categories. So the Brennan report was talking about all these social media policies and from these tech companies sort of having very strict guidelines around, you know, like terrorism and terrorism terminology, but then kind of into connecting that with Islamophobia in certain ways and confusing that with Islamophobia, and that being sort of tied to prejudices that, you know, those coming in with a particular perspective have about who a terrorist is and where that terrorist background is from. That leading to actually like further victimization of a marginalized group where unintentionally they're sort of including language kind of from their perspectives or from their biases into their categorizations of what it means for someone to be talking about terrorist activity, and that ending up sort of as another dimension of oppression that this marginalized group has to face online. So I think there's also this like caution we have to have of like content moderation tools not adding to the oppression of those already experiencing that online harm as well. But yeah, that's an excellent observation, and that's a super cool anecdote too about you know, that example of misogyny and how there's a phenomena too that we just won't know until we talk to the affected population. Yeah, so many reasons to talk to those going through it.
Yeah, and as Virak mentioned in the chat, so I wanted to go back to Murali too, because this all requires data that has some representation of a minority group, or annotation that is annotators who have some representation of that group, or even definition that captures that kind of rhetoric against that group. How can that be operationalized for targeted groups such as like targeted groups based on caste hate speech?
Oh, if people don't self-identify as being part of that marginalized group?
So it was, yeah, it's basically based on Murali's this week talk about how lower castes are not represented even in the data sets. There isn't that initiation for even recognizing that kind of hate. So maybe Murali, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I think we need to start from the shifting of a mindset. You mentioned twice it's a minority and under minority data sets, but it's not. We're talking about 2 billion people from South Asia, so that's not minority. So basically, the first of all, we need to actually think through who we are talking about, and do we actually take them for the the proportionate representation these communities actually represent, right? So that's the thing. So the second thing, because what happens is that this is not a direct complaint against you, but this is a sort of a narrative that's actually been in circulation, which is all about, even Europeans as together, it's actually a little less than the entire Indian population. They seem to be considered the most worthy enough to invest resources to actually put in more develop research in understanding their data sets and so on and so forth. So in my talk, what I mentioned was, where is the research in resources that's coming to South Asian population or cost-affected population, which also actually develop huge amount of data. So one thing is that to speak in capitalist language, which I'm not extremely comfortable with, but just for the sake of argument, we need to understand if this particular area is generating so much of data and related income revenues thereof, then these tech companies should be held to account, number one, in order to provide the right services. The consumers are entitled to a fair service, fair and just services, number one. And in terms of actually, I'm also kind of combining previous questions that other people have answered, which have a different take. How do we actually bring resources together? What is that we need to do? No, I want to illustrate an example which might be quite interesting to some of the people here. When the British Raj came to subcontinent, and I'm talking about 250 years ago, they prepare a detailed taxonomy of caste without any digital tools. And it's in their own interest, of course, right? And it was one of the first ever on this planet ever created largest public data sets. And we are talking about like almost 100 million people at 250 years ago. So it is a question of commercial interest and reputation economy and capital. Now we need to convert these, or we need to shift these terms of debates into how such empathic approaches might help not only the communities to keep them safe, but also to keep these companies, keep going. That's what I meant by capitalist argument. So there is a reputation economy. There is enough justification to do this, but what happens here is that there is no a commercial and political will to do it. So very often, what happens is that very often we kind of tend to generalize, these are minority data sets, but they are not. And minority data sets can be quite useful in many ways. And that's been talked about all day today. So I think we should actually get, and then, for example, Deborah said, if a data set is not working for a machine learning process, not working for someone else, it's not working for anybody, right? So in that sense, we have to actually agree on certain sort of ethical consensus and standards, how we are going to, this is one of the things I said about content moderation needs to be decentralized. And it's extremely easy and very much doable task in terms of academics, civil society, activist organization, tech people to come together to create a pool of a reliable, testable public data sets. It's not that difficult at all. For that to happen, tech companies should actually come forward and be transparent about what is that they're collecting, how is that we can learn from that. That's another thing, because at the moment, especially I'm speaking from cost per data sets point of view, we do not know what sort of data they're collecting in terms of that actually aggregates and profiles cost in terms from users point of view, or in terms of understanding point of view. However, we know the results of these kind of a building, the structures, costly structures, and we have. I kind of listed a few examples of how costist the front end is. That means it is not happening. It's not an accident. Something was happening because it's been consciously. Someone is doing it. So they have to be transparent about it. Once we are transparent about it, we need to be able to have some sort of constructive cooperation. For that to happen, I feel machine learners, coders, tech corporations, civil society, activists, and academics I think there should be some sort of a multi-stakeholder crowdsourced initiative, even to prove that this model can work. And once this work, and then we can say it is in the interest of everybody, including in the interest of the Valley companies, and then we would be able to move forward. But what we need now is, I'm purely talking from a cost point of view, from race, sexual misogyny, and other. You guys have gone up further down the road. For us, we were not even part of the game. We are not even the race, part of the race. So what we want to do is that, could we just acknowledge and then pool the resources together and start doing some element of, for example, a great example is that how internet benefits from caste-based e-commerce. And is that allowed? And how do we actually track that? So we need to ask very simple questions to understand that how internet remains to be cost sensitive, and then where do we proceed further? So first we need evidence, and based on evidence, we need to build method, and based on method, we can actually create some actionable interventions. It's because we are actually sub-zero people in terms of in the race. Thanks.
Oh, yes. By minority, I actually meant minoritized in the data set or in the representation. Because, yeah, as you mentioned, not just about a very small group of people. And so also in that regard, evaluating those methods, like getting to the fairness of such methods, and even defining what fairness is in this context. How do you think, do you have any like suggestions? Do you think like even like defining these biases, these fairnesses can be something that is crowdsourced, or is there like a collaboration of target groups and stakeholders and even academic researchers?
Well, I can share one interesting best practice that has just begun to happen. I don't know how far that's going to be operationalized, how far that's going to be implemented, but in principle, I do still consider it's a best practice. Sorry, Twitter India. But just a bit of a context here. When Jack visited India, he met Prime Minister and others, and he actually had a meeting with a group of women, or feminists, quote unquote. And in that, a Dalit woman handed him a poster which said, smash Brahminical patriarchy, dominant caste patriarchy, right? So Jack held that poster. It was, screenshotted, and everyone loved it for a day. And then there was a huge backlash, PR backlash, because a dominant caste Twitter account said, you are actually meddling with Indian culture, which I had mentioned in my talk, culturing caste, right? So you cultured the caste practice. And then Twitter, cut the long story short, Twitter immediately said, oh, this is not our official position. We just actually happen to be in the picture. Can you imagine if Jack actually said the same thing about Black Lives Matter? Right? So this comes from a lot of layers here, number one, right? And after this happened, Dalit groups in India actively engaged with Twitter India, and then Twitter India recognized they actually are not doing a great job. So they initiated a process. Through that process included talking to Dalit civil society organizations, Dalit feminists, and other oppressed groups, and they brought them all together and said, what is that we should be doing? Because Twitter India was a default on many levels. One of the complaints was Dalit handles were not verified as much as compared to how dominant caste handles were verified, and Twitter India was not transparent about it at all. So the best practice they actually trying to implement here is that they're trying to have a multi-stakeholder conversation and trying to understand what is that you think that we should be doing to make sure that Dalits feel that they are not oppressed or marginalized. So I think one of the point I'm trying to lead home is that I think we should actually leave the data sets and quality of data sets, that they're all good arguments. I have no problem with that. But we need to actually ask the right questions. Only right questions will lead us to fetch right kind of data. The problem is that we often actually jump at we often think in terms of a data, but as a qualitative ethnographer, I always actually like to ask the right question and then turn those questions into quantifiable data. So if the British Empire could have completed the taxonomy of entire subcontinent caste system in a non-digital manner in less than 5 years' time, that was the time they took. And this could have happened. This can happen in less than 2 years with the money that these guys have. So it's a question of actually right thinking, right political will. That's all.
Yeah, thank you. And considering that these social hierarchies are captured both in like how we define abuse and how the data sets are captured and annotated, I wanted to ask Leon, like, are we talking about the same task when we are talking about abuse in different contexts or cultures, or how would this social hierarchy that is embedded in this definition can be transferred to different contexts? So when we are talking about like a global data set, does the minority groups in a culture who are like the majority group in another culture have the same impact in that data set, or are captured in the same way, or being treated in the same way? Can we have like this kind of global definition?
Interesting question. Thank you. So I want to take 20 seconds. I was asked to explain my T-shirt, and I think maybe this has been a case of Poe's law. So there's a twin T-shirt that goes with this, with a narrow waist designed for women, just with scientist written on it, and it's meant to make the irony that scientists get called scientists in the news, whereas if you happen to encounter a scientist who somehow magically is also female, it's very important to say it's an unusual creature, a female scientist, which is pretty awful. So it satirizes this, and so I'm the unusual male scientist. Sorry, so the just to be clear,
that's great, thank you.
But yeah, it's a maybe a slightly too deep irony to be immediately obvious, so I apologize for that. That's a really interesting question. I mean, the really important thing for me when I approach this, I don't have a global answer, right? I mean, there's most things I don't know, most groups I've never been a part of. Who am I to speak for those? But I think it's super important to recognize that individual communities, however you like to define community, right, with any kind of homophily, they'll have their own norms for behavior. And we will never get one data set, one taxonomy that will be able to reasonably kind of give it a good level of detail for what is acceptable, not acceptable, and how a certain abusive or non-abusive phenomenon is going to be guaranteed to present, right? I think when we look at the more strong kinds of online abuse that might be made illegal by law, consistently across countries, right? Things like death threats, this perhaps we could get one to agree on, but if one wants to add more texture, right, to this, then one has to look at community norms. So maybe a data set could be developed that would capture many different kinds of behavior and classify those. But I think even in the act of adding a classification of something that comes from a taxonomy with the word abusive associated with that taxonomy, even a simple classification of something that isn't abusive in many communities comes with a stigma, right? And the other way around. I mean, if we say, well, this looks like a discussion and the person looks like ignorant and curious, then someone might use this to back up a point that actually what they're saying isn't malicious because the classifier put it as this, even though it might be actually quite damaging to an individual community. So I think that's really unlikely. I mean, it's just the context is so important, both where the classifier is applied, where the taxonomy is derived from, and the communities that are involved. That's my intuition. But I mean, this is a continuation of the semi-bleak call for help I hoped to paint in my keynote. Just we can't assume a universal taxonomy for this.
Right. And one other attribute that I just was thinking about is time as a contextual attribute that can affect abuse detection data sets. So for example, ever since the pandemic, online hate targeting Asian people has increased a lot. So, and this includes expressions or language that hasn't been used before. And data sets that were ever created before that does not include this kind of language. So how can this being dynamic is can be defined for creating data sets and for models? Like, if you have any comments or suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, the context in which you gather data is going to really skew the classifier, right? We see with named entity recognition, there's the Connell 03 data set, which is a bit of a classic in named entity recognition, was collected over a very narrow time period. So if you look at the person entities in this, you look at the top 20 most frequent by surface form, and I think we have all the members, or most of the members, of the 1996 Pakistan cricket team, right? Which is great, but also these probably aren't the 20 most frequent person names that one would see in English overall. So that temporal dimension is really added. And those, of course, are tournament ongoing over time. So this has really added a skew to that data. I mean, you can try and take technical measures, but predicting the future is tough. I think maybe a better thing to do is assume that all classifiers for this kind of thing are just rotting slowly over time.
Just to add,
I wanted to ask you to,
I definitely think that, and this is sort of ideally an aspect of the internal audit process, is to understand expiration dates and understand when models become obsolete. I definitely think that every model is very contextually bound, and that includes being time bound and being bound to a particular demographic that they represent. Something I wanted to also mention is that there's also a possibility that perhaps toxicity classification is not something that's a very good supervised learning problem. And it's maybe not a very valid task. I think, Leon, in your talk at one point, you were like, maybe this is just not something you can objectively determine, or I'm not sure if you said that out of frustration, but it sort of is possible that we're not going to find a data set that's going to cover every single situation. And, the solution to this might be a more localized approach to implementing these models. It might be something more similar or personalized, similar to a recommendation system type thing, where it's taking a more sort of individualized approach to moderation. And there's sort of this interesting paper I read recently on, it's called the disagreement deconvolution, and they were talking about how at times, for toxicity classifiers, especially, but really any sort of community-based moderation situation, including, judging misinformation, you can have two annotators that just, because of their differing worldviews, just fundamentally disagree. It's not a question of, one is correct and the other is incorrect, but they're just both independently correct and in disagreement. And I think that definitely is a possibility with toxicity, where you have a situation where one community might judge it to be a toxic situation, another community might judge it to not be a toxic situation, and they're both correct. How do you address that, and how do you resolve that? And it's possible that we might have to think a little bit more creatively than we currently do in order to address that kind of challenge. The other point I wanted to make was, I think Murali mentioned something very interesting about, having, British authorities sort of coming in and imposing caste categories and imposing sort of identity definitions, and also imposing, definitions of what it means for, something to work or something to not work. And I think that that's really an interesting situation where we've been starting to talk about it more and more, but this idea that those, those that are defining these communities and those that are defining and determining what is toxic and what is not toxic are those in power, right? They're those that are like, when I was working with an engineering team, me and my colleagues would be making a lot of engineering decisions that were really consequential, like things around determining the taxonomy of different models. And you make those decisions as an engineer very lightly. You don't understand that it actually is the byproduct of you having a lot of power to define this taxonomy that the annotators will then use to determine the outcomes of the model. So I think that there's a conversation to be had about the kind of power that those within these companies have to determine, how to categorize people and how to categorize these harms. And, to Murali's point around, well, what does it mean to have a more decentralized approach? Perhaps a more decentralized approach is one in which there's broader participation in that process of, identifying different identities and also identifying different categories or collecting the data or defining the model or having an appeals process where people that don't see themselves as, participants of like the mainstream population that this model is built for, having the opportunity to opt out or to push back against predictions that don't serve them. So, all of these participatory approaches or mechanisms are things that have been explored in other fields. In the HCI field, it's been very heavily sort of discussed and explored. Can any of that be useful here in terms of how we talk about online abuse? I'm hopeful, I think so. And I think it might be one way to just, distribute some of that power that's really now very strongly held by those that are at these companies, determining everything from, how to categorize people to how to categorize harms. So I think that approach of participation might be one way to decentralize things.
Just can I come in just on to two things? Yeah, and I appreciate that what Deb said, but I just wanted to just clarify that I want to be very careful that the British reified caste system. They did not actually impose caste system. Okay, that's a sort of a post-colonial narrative that sometimes people tend to talk about. But the system has been there for thousands of years. It's not the British brought it and enforced upon us, but they kind of attacks on, they did that. It's got its own problems. So I agree with the complexities, yes. Yeah. The other point that I'd just like to touch upon, for about online hate targeting Asian people, that hate is expressed with a new language and so on. I think I'm having a very interesting take. I'm just trying to understand, because I don't speak some of the languages that's been spoken about in this particular context, or maybe not be familiar. But what I can actually tell you is that there are two levels of, this is something quite cultural and philosophical and political as well. There are two levels of oppression in terms of conversational, communicative oppression. One is the outcome of the feeling, which is actually you feel humiliated because you hear something, someone spoke to you about something, or oppression. So there's lots of disarming emotions when that's kind of largely amounts to offense online speech, but the triggers might be different. A racial trigger is different from casteist trigger. A casteist trigger are different from misogynist triggers. My feeling is that if we had asked the right questions about understanding these triggers from each protected characteristics, we wouldn't be actually having this conversation. Oh, this is a completely new language sets that's come into play. So probably in an ideal manner, we should have invested in looking at what are the kind of racialized triggers and slurs, specifically in relation to these Asian people. And what are the sort of slurs and triggers? Because at the end, that I also feel humiliated, someone else also feels humiliated, but our triggers are different. So to understand these triggers, that's where the qualitative questions need to be quantified. What actually constitutes triggers to this particular community as opposed to this community? And that both leads to humiliation. To me, what seems to be happening now, what's online slur, what's offensive, it's the kind of end result. But what I'd like to do is actually taking a step back, So that's actually our end result, humiliation and feeling hurt and slurred. And that's the kind of end framing and filtering. But there is a step before. What constitutes slur to a woman as opposed to what constitutes a slur to a Dalit? So that's where you have a qualitative questions that need to be put in, and those results can be quantified. This is what I've been trying to say in various words. So we just need to ask the right questions, to be honest. If we so the question we should be saying, how did we fail to ask the right question to understand triggers for these Asian communities in this particular context? Otherwise, we would have captured those when this was happening. Because I don't think, I mean, this is my view. I mean, I don't think that people actually suddenly invent new type of slur. I can tell you from cost perspective, that we have affirmative action similar to what you have in the US, Deb. Mm-hmm. When the COVID actually happened, there was a caste slur that started happening on Twitter. Oh, if you want to actually have everything, if you want to have a peace in everything, if you want to have a peace in everything, like prioritized, why don't you have a peace in COVID-19 virus? Right? The question here is not actually a new narrative about COVID-19. Here, the question is that we should have already talked about, looked at, is that affirmative action and then how that actually creates the trigger. Mm-hmm. So if we had that sort of qualitative data sets in the first place, then we would be able to simply correlate and understand what's been going on. And that's what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Murali. And I think we have to wrap this conversation up because we are out of time, but I really enjoyed, and I really want to know if you have any final thoughts before we end the conversation. Okay, so Leon?
I think I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone working in this field. It doesn't make anything easier, right? Working in this, as Timnit pointed out, but it's definitely important work we're doing, I feel, anyway. So yeah, I'm just very grateful to see so many other people taking on this problem.
Yeah, I would totally second that. I think it's also like, I really appreciate sort of just also how there's something very universal about this issue of online harm. It's something that you know, like throughout different geographic regions, people are experiencing their own version of it, and we're all kind of in this shared online space, and everyone is sort of navigating through it in their own way. So there is something very personal about it, but there's also something very universal about it as well. So it's just attempting to identify what are the actual mechanisms that are going to make life easier for those that are impacted. I kind of try to mention this at the end of my talk, but I think something that academics sometimes lose track of, which is very easy to lose track of because our incentives are really weird, but you know, actually thinking through interventions and solutions that are going to make the life of those that are really going through a hard time because of this online abuse problem, making their lives easier in some way. So really thinking through, like, what are the moderation interventions that we can implement and that we can think of that has sort of this not even necessarily immediate, but tangible and meaningful impact on the lives of those that are going through it right now. I think that that's the scope of challenges that we should be focused on, or we should that sort of have that urgency because you have people going through it. So that's something I guess I would remind, or like a kind of final thought or final word, is that I really hope this conversation today revealed just the reality of this problem. And I hope that people are inspired to pursue interventions that will work to shift that reality over time and to change that reality in meaningful ways, rather than you know, simply just publishing a data set for the sake of publishing a data set. You know, I think those academic conversations are really interesting and meaningful, but we need to actually get to a point where we're doing things that are really making people's lives better as well.
Yeah, thank you to all our panelists. And we are moving to the share task session.